everyone. It's Professor Dan here, welcoming you to another edition of Professor Dan Explains Stuff in Ethics. Ethics, philosophy's way of showing you why all the bad things you do are wrong, so as you continue to do them, you can feel a little bit more guilty about it. Today, we're going to talk about Aristotle's virtue theory. So, virtue theory is a little bit different from the other kinds of ethics you might have seen on some of the other videos you may have watched, insofar as virtue has to do essentially with people's character. So it's a way of looking at ethics where the actions that we take stem from the kind of person that we are. So if we can cultivate better character, presumably we will take better actions. And so because of that, it's a little bit more individual than some of our other moral theories are. We're looking at your individual character here more than we're necessarily looking at whether or not your action was universalizable or it produced some kind of an outcome. We're going to be concerned with your intentions and your outcomes, but in a more individualistic way, but that's still, we can make good arguments about in terms of making arguments about moral theories. So in order to get into this then, it's sometimes helpful to understand in Aristotle why we want to do things in the first place. Now for Aristotle, you could know any particular thing based on different causes. One of those causes was called the final cause, or the thing that you move towards. Right? The final cause of building a house is a house to live in. The final cause of learning an instrument is to be a musician. So Aristotle said then that there are different ways that we can go about telling the worthiness of these causes. Some of these things are things that we use for the sake of something else, and some are things that we use for the sake of themselves alone. According to Aristotle, the thing that we always pursue only for its own sake and never for the sake of any other thing is what we call happiness. Right? There are other things that we pursue for the sake of something else. So, for the most part, we have a job in order to make money, in order to buy the things that we need. But if we already had the things that we needed, we maybe wouldn't have that job. Some things we pursue for their own sake as well as the sake of other things they provide for us. Presumably we acquire educations because they're good for their own sake, but also because they give us the skills we need for better jobs and things like that. But happiness is something, he says, we always pursue for its own sake and never for the sake of something else. So think about it this way. You might go and try to get a good job to make a lot of money because you think a lot of money will make you happy. But you would never try to get a lot of happy in order to make you money. That would not make any sense. Happiness then has external conditions, and it has one important internal condition. Aristotle was a fairly pragmatic philosopher, and he thought that you had to have certain material conditions to be a happy person. You had to have enough material wealth, not necessarily being rich or anything like that, but you couldn't be poor, so you weren't sure where your next meal was coming from or anything like that. You had to have a certain amount of health. It's very hard to be happy if you're in sickness and pain all the time. You had to have a certain amount of status. You had to have good social standing and friends. Aristotle was big on friends. Virtue ethicists tend to talk about friendship. It's hard to be happy if you're poor and sick and you have no friends. But those are all external conditions and they can all go away. So what Aristotle says is that the best guarantee for happiness, it turns out, is to be a virtuous person. That is, he says happiness is an activity of the soul that corresponds with virtue. So if we can become virtuous people, that gives us the best shot of being happiness. So also, if we become virtuous, then we have internal conditions for happiness, and those change with much more difficulty. They can still change. Nobody, like Aristotle, is going to say that you couldn't be made miserable if you endure hardship after hardship after hardship. But if you can become virtuous, you're more likely to become happy, and happiness is what everybody pursues for its own sake. So now that we have that down, we need to know something about virtue. So virtue is something that we can pursue in one of two ways. And I'll use some different colors now for those of you who are visual learners. There are what are called intellectual virtues. I think I might have spelled intellectual wrong. And there are what we call moral virtues. An intellectual virtue is something which we are taught. Right? So things like math. You're taught math, and then presumably once you know the math, you'll always know it, although it turns out that that is wrong, and I probably couldn't do a quadratic equation now to save my life. But theoretically, once you learn it the one time, you will have learned it. That's an intellectual virtue. You can be certified as having an intellectual virtue. For example, people can give you a degree in a subject. So if you have a PhD in a subject, then you're considered to be virtuous in that subject, and that's conferred by other people who've established the virtue through the credential. We're not going to be talking about these kinds of virtues, though. We're going to be looking at moral virtues, which have to be practiced. Practiced to the point where they become a habit. So a moral virtue or a virtue of character is something you have to build by doing it. So Aristotle likes to use examples. He says, for example, it's by practicing at music that we become musicians. It's by practicing at woodworking that we become carpenters and things like this. Nobody would say that you're a musician because you looked at a piece of sheet music once and saw what the notes were. Right? You actually have to play the instrument in order to be a musician. You actually have to practice moral virtues in order to be virtuous in this sense. Now, people like Aristotle would look at lots of different characteristics and claim that there were virtues that went with them. We have been saying that moral actions are actions that affect other people. So if you're looking at the various virtues that Aristotle talks about, we're going to make another distinction within moral virtues between those which are self-referential and those which are other referencing. And we're going to try to concentrate a little bit more on the other referencing. So, now that we know the difference here, we have to it might help us rather if we had a definition of what a moral virtue is. So Aristotle has such a definition. Virtue, he says, is a mean between two extremes. It's a mean between two extremes. One of those extremes is going to be an excess, and one is going to be, let's see if I could spell this word, deficiency. I think I spelled that right. If I've misspelled anything, feel free to send nasty notes to whomever you would like to send nasty notes to. It's what he calls a human mean. And it's determined by, I'll move my little eraser over here, by prudence or by a practical person if we ourselves lack prudence. Prudence is practical wisdom. So let's break this down a little bit, and then we'll use some specific examples. A mean is a mathematical device, so the mean between 2 and 6 is 4. But the mean in the sense of virtue in Aristotle's Ethics is a little bit more flexible. But whatever it is, it's between these two extremes. Sometimes the in-between, which is the virtue, is going to be closer to one than the other, and we'll see some examples of that. But it's a human mean, and that really references two things. One, we're talking about the virtues of people, not gods or dogs. We're not really interested in what makes a god virtuous or a dog virtuous. We're interested in what makes a person virtuous, so it's a human mean. But it also speaks to the fact that for different people, the mean is going to be at a different place relative to the excess or the deficiency. So there's some individualism here too. Maybe not as much as you might think in some cases, but there is some, and it's also going to change over time. What is the mean for me today is different than what it was yesterday and what it will be tomorrow. When we say it's determined by prudence, that's your practical reasoning. But sometimes we lack practical reasoning with respect to certain virtues, and so we can appeal to those who are experts and they can help determine it for us. Now let's talk about this with two examples. So I'm going to give you all a second to write all these things down before I erase it and it's gone forever, unless you can press rewind on the video, I guess. I'm going to use two different virtues. One which is more self-referential, and that's the virtue of temperance, and one which looks at others, and that's the virtue of generosity. So, temperance is the virtue that's associated with the right amount of food and drink. The Greeks were really into dietary stuff. They spent a lot of time thinking about how much to eat, how much to drink, how you should do it, what sort of exercising you should be doing. They really spent a lot of time. They were very fascinated by these things. And so a virtuous person is one who eats and drinks the right amount. Now the excess, I think red was my excess color, right? I don't remember. I think blue was my deficiency color, but I wrote generosity in blue. Oh no, now I'm confusing everybody who's a visual learner. So the excess is, I'm going to put that, equals gluttony. That's somebody who eats and drinks too much all the time. Right? That's the excess of this, is gluttony. Now Aristotle, interestingly, if you read the Ethics, when he brings up the example of temperance, he knows the excess is gluttony. He didn't really think there was a word for the deficiency because he thought nobody in the world would purposefully eat and drink too little. That just didn't make any sense to him. So we know that there are people who suffer from that condition. So we'll say the deficiency is, let's say the deficiency is somebody who is ascetic. That is, that they just don't eat and drink enough at all. The virtue is temperance. Now, this is self-referential because my temperance doesn't affect anybody else, presumably, or my lack of temperance, as you may be noting right now. In any case, that's why it's self-referential. My eating or drinking doesn't affect what you do. How much I should eat and drink can also be different than somebody else. For example, since I'm a big person, what it takes to keep me going might be different than somebody who is half my size. What I could eat and drink when I was 20 years younger is different than what it will be when I'm 20 years older. What I could eat and drink when I was in really good physical condition once upon a time is going to be different than it is now. Same goes for other sorts of people. What a professional athlete needs to eat and drink when he or she is competing at the top of their game is different after they retire and so on. There's another thing to keep in mind too. What's right to eat and drink on, say, an established feast day is different than on other days. So if you, for example, were visiting people on a day like Thanksgiving, maybe by Thanksgiving we'll be visiting people in large numbers again, right? You would want to eat and drink a lot on that day because it's an established feast day, and it would be inappropriate to not overindulge. But if you ate and drank a Thanksgiving amount of food every day, that would obviously be too much. So that's how temperance works. I think most people find that easy enough to understand. The virtue, by the way, is probably closer to the deficiency, right? It's much easier, especially in our society, to overindulge than it is to underindulge. So the virtue will usually be closer to this than it is to this. Now, and I want to come back to this in a little bit, but now I want to talk about generosity. Generosity is the virtue that deals with money, the appropriate giving of money or things that have monetary value. Not any value, monetary value. The excess of this is what's called liberality. That's somebody who gives too much. A person who's always giving stuff away, always spending money on people all the time, without any regard to whether it's appropriate or not. That person is what we call somebody who's engaged in liberality. The deficiency here is somebody who is miserly. That's somebody who gives too little. In this case, the virtue, that is generosity, is going to probably be closer to the excess than the deficiency. That is, giving the right amount is going to usually be closer to giving too much rather than giving too little. Also, by the way, the mean will be closer to the extreme that more people tend to struggle with, because Aristotle says it takes a lot of practice and it's hard to be virtuous. So that's why the virtue of temperance is closer to being an ascetic, and the virtue of generosity is closer to liberality. Now, once again, what counts as virtue is going to be different for different people. If I'm somebody who's making $3 million a year as a consultant type person or whatever, what counts as generosity for me in terms of, say, a percentage of my income is going to maybe be different than somebody who's a middle-class person making, say, $80,000 a year. Sometimes people will say, well, why can't I just have a rule, give 10%? Well, if I'm making $3 million a year, 10% might be too little. If I'm making $80,000 a year, maybe 10% is just right. But what if I'm somebody who made some poor choices in college and so ended up becoming something like, I don't know, a public school teacher? In that case, somebody's making $40,000 a year, given 10% or $4,000, that might be way too much, because $40,000 a year, you're probably more or less going to be living check to check if you're trying to have any kind of family and live in a house in an area with a high cost of living. So again, the amounts are going to vary depending on the person, what they're doing, and so on. Now here comes the part that makes this even more fun. Is it possible for somebody to be temperate if they're living in an area that is experiencing food shortages? You might be wondering, well, wait a minute, if there's no food where I live, if people are starving, then are they automatically temperate? No. You can only be temperate if you have enough food to be able to make a choice. Starving people aren't temperate, they are starving. Well, what about generosity then? Now here it gets really fun. Often when I do this in a live setting, somebody will say, well, wait a minute, can't I be generous? What if I want to be generous with something else in case I'm that poor high school teacher you were talking about and I don't have any money to give? And Aristotle would say, well, if you have no money to give, then you cannot, in fact, be generous. Because generosity is the virtue that has to do with giving and receiving things that are worth money. And if you don't have that material condition, that is, you don't have money, you can't be generous. At which point somebody will always say, well, can't I be generous with my time? And I will ask that person, well, are you a lawyer? And they'll say, well, no, you said I was a school teacher. I said, oh, well, that's too bad, because then your time's not worth anything, so no, you can't be generous with your time. And then they get all sad, and then I get happy because I feed off the sadness of others. And then I explain, well, there's another virtue called kindness, but that's a different virtue than generosity, and that leads to the next thing to talk about, which is the fact that how many virtues are there? There's a lot. Which is why, if you rewind, you will recall that this whiteboard had something about prudence, or as a practical person would determine it. It's really, really very difficult to know what the specific virtue is for each and every different kind of thing. That's why we want practical people to be able to help us out. Think of them as virtue trainers. So just like if you need help with your temperance, you might hire a nutritionist, and if you need help with money matters, you might hire a financial advisor. Well, you can do this when it comes to all the other virtues as well. Now, there's a couple more things I want to bring to your attention that make this extra special fun. Sometimes people will wonder about some other conditions. For example, they'll say, well, wait a minute, could I be, we'll pick a different virtue like courage. Could I be a courageous criminal? And Aristotle would say no to that. In order to be virtuous, your virtue has to be in a good cause, right? You can't be a courageous murderer, right? You can't be a professional hitman and be courageous even though you're confronting death all the time, because it's in a bad cause, right? So you can't be, no matter what your individual state of character might be, you can't have virtue if you're doing something that is bad, right? There's no virtuous amount of murdering people or stealing or being a fan of a Philadelphia sports teams. All those things are inherently bad, and so therefore there's no virtuous amount of doing them. The other thing you have to have is you have to have the right kind of intention. If I eat and drink the right amount of food because I want to be temperate and I understand this and it pleases me to be temperate, then I might be virtuous. If I eat and drink the right amount of food because a medical doctor, that's the kind of doctor that helps people, if I was told by a medical doctor, you better start eating and drinking the right amount of food or you're going to be dead soon, well, then that's not particularly virtuous because I'm just scared of dying, and so that's why I'm eating the way I'm supposed to eat. But if I weren't scared of dying, then I would be eating fried cheese and giant turkey legs all day long. Same thing with generosity. If I am generous because it pleases me to give money to other people whom I know need it, and I have the money to give, and I understand why I'm doing it, and it gets the desired result, right? We need to have a result, right? You're not virtuous because you tried to be good. You're virtuous because you're actually good. If I'm being generous because I know and I want to be generous, that's one thing. If I'm only giving 10% of my income to the church and charities because I'm scared that I'm going to be sent to hell forever for not having been generous, then there's nothing virtuous about it. even though I may have given the same amount of money. And virtue is about internal character, not just about your intention and not just about your result, but all of that mixed together. That's what makes virtue very difficult, but it also can make it very individually rewarding too. So that's how virtue theory works. You have to have material conditions, you have to want to be virtuous, and you have to practice at it until it becomes a habit. So that's it for virtue. Until we see you next time, this is Professor Dan saying, have fun.